Amid Goebbels' propaganda blaring through the loudspeakers, mocking the Allies as a mongrel alliance, insisting that such a motley crowd could never defeat the superior Aryan race, dawn broke on June 6, 1944. The leaden grey skies over Normandy were ripped open, and a colossal industrial machine began grinding down every illusion. Just weeks later, what had been scorned as Mongrel transformed into a united fist, smashing open the gates of Paris. Loudspeakers screeched across a foggy European square. A dry male voice droned over and over. A patchwork alliance, mongrels. A rabble that cannot stand leaflets fluttered down, black and white, with giant letters smearing Americans, Britons, Canadians, Free French, and even black soldiers, the squads from India and North Africa. They were branded a mongrel coalition, the very opposite of the so-called elite. No one answered back, no argument was needed. Only hands tightening the straps of their packs, checking the last safety pin, the last latch, and fixing their eyes straight ahead. The leaden sky opened above the sea on the morning of June 6, 1944. The horizon disappeared beneath a moving mass of black. Never before had humanity seen an armada like this. 7,000 ships loaded with men and steel, 130,000 soldiers crossing the channel, and above them a canopy of 20,000 aircraft. Another 20,000 would descend from the sky just before dawn. The numbers were not abstract. They became waves, wind, the roar of engines, the stench of oil, the nausea on the decks, and the dry eyes staring into the thinning fog where the French beaches would emerge only hours away. But before that morning came meticulous planning, measured down to the last detail, hammered out by brilliant minds behind closed doors in December 1943 in Tehran. 3 leaders stood together in a rare photograph. Stalin satisfied, Churchill heavy with thought, Roosevelt calm and silent. They did not argue slogans. They sealed a decision to open the Western Front. Stalin had pressed for a second front ever since the Soviet Union entered the war. Churchill and Roosevelt had wrestled for 2 years over timing, direction, and the political fallout after victory. That decision did more than launch a campaign. It shaped the course of the war and the world order that would follow. On the other side, Nazi Germany swallowed its dread with concrete and steel. The Atlantic Wall stretched nearly 4,000 miles from Norway to the Spanish border, swallowing 13 million tons of concrete, bristling with gun emplacements, bunkers, and minefields. Most German officers believed any invasion would come at Calais, just 25 miles from the English shore, the shortest and most logical crossing. Yet even as the loudspeakers kept railing against mongrels, one American quietly signed the orders and flew to London. On January 15, 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike, assumed supreme command of Operation Overlord. On his maps, pencil lines traced the northern French coast, arrows marked objectives with notes on tides, moon phases, and wind speeds. He needed a British counterpart and chose Bernard Montgomery to command the ground forces. Together they made a decision that defied German expectations. Normandy, not Calais. The coast was farther, but the defences were weaker. Striking at the place that seemed not short enough would, in truth, be the closest route to victory. Outside the conference rooms, supply convoys kept pounding Britain's ports. Steel rang on steel. Massive Phoenix caissons waited to be hauled out to sea to become artificial harbours. On training grounds, soldiers crawled under barbed wire, engineers tested mine flails. Blank rounds thundered, and black smoke covered the sand. No one went on the airwaves to spar with Goebbels. Their preparations were precise, their answer singular: action. Young soldiers sat huddled around field stoves in the damp evening chill. A mess tin held someone's open letter home, half-written. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll be fine." No one could promise that. But everything was in place. The moon charts, the tides, the routes, the takeoff schedules, the landing craft assignments, the patchwork the enemy mocked, Americans, Britons, Canadians, Free French, had meshed together like the cogs of a single machine. Each tooth fit into place. All that remained was time and the weather. On the deck of a ship, an American sergeant leaned against the rail, staring into the fog. He knew nothing of speeches in Berlin. He only knew that in a few hours the ramp would drop, water would slap his face, and the sand of Normandy would be at his boots. In the map room in London, Ike slowly set his pen down on the table, as though ending an invisible debate. The decision had been made in Tehran. The campaign had been born of 2 years of argument among the Allies. Now it was given the green light. They mocked a patchwork alliance, the voiceover concludes, but the great machine had begun to turn, and dawn was drawing very near. On the other side of the battle lines, atop the dunes of Normandy, Rommel walked along the shoreline with a dog-eared notebook, marking each gap between fortified towns. The Luftwaffe had been drawn inland to counter bombing raids, which meant the coming fight would fall mostly to infantry and naval forces. Rommel's obstacles, X-shaped wooden stakes rigged with mines, dragon's teeth and anti-tank barricades, sprouted thick across the beach approaches. But from Calais to Lower Brittany stretched 750 miles of coastline. No matter how densely sown, the mines were still just drops scattered on a giant's cloak. Across the channel, massive blocks of concrete, flat-faced like fortress walls, were being cast into sections given the cold name Phoenix. They wouldn't remain in port. When the time came, they would be towed to Normandy, sunk and arranged into breakwaters, forming the artificial Mulberry harbours. Inside them, floating roadways and steel pontoons fit together like toys, but toys built at adult scale, capable of unloading tons of supplies and thousands of men, regardless of the tide. A storm coming. The harbour would still rise where no harbour existed. That was the language of industry. Blunt, relentless, needing no exaggeration. On England's training grounds, the practice beaches stretched across every terrain, from soft sand to gravel. Engineers tested mine flails, slowly carving lanes through barbed defences. Makeshift trackways were laid in haste so convoys could cross the mud. Farther out, monsters like the Churchill crocodile belched long sheets of fire, consuming mock pillboxes. There were accidents. A few hundred lives was the cost already paid before a single boot touched the real sand. But commanders had no right to discard any scenario. Every mistake on the training grounds could mean one more life saved on the day to come. By February 1944, more than 800,000 American troops were already in Britain. The numbers swelled, southern bases grew packed, and village lanes gave way to depots and training fields. By early June, 1.5 million Americans had crowded into southern England. On the docks, sailors shouted cadence as 20,000 vehicles backed into shipholds. An odd manoeuvre, but necessary, so when the bow ramps dropped, every machine could charge straight onto the beach. 19 ports thundered in rhythm, the grind of chains and engines echoing through the night, mixing with music from parish churches now turned into makeshift clubs. Nearby, British and Canadian forces readied 21,000 men for the spearhead. The maps divided the beaches cleanly. They would strike Gold, Juno and Sword, while the Americans aimed for Utah and Omaha. Every piece of industrial ingenuity was paired with a concrete answer to the battlefield. Phoenix was the answer to the lack of a deep-water port on day one. Pontoons were the answer to the shifting tides. Mine flails were the answer to Rommel's obstacles. Crocodiles were the answer to pillboxes that bombs had missed. And the backward loading of 20,000 vehicles was the answer to that single moment when the ramps dropped and machines had to surge forward, not fumble for space to turn. American superiority did not lie in a single invention, but in the ability to systematize, to turn tactical needs into assembly lines, to transform obstacles into engineering problems, to make time itself into a schedule. Along the coast, entire camps of deception took shape. Fake antenna towers, dummy airstrips, inflatable aircraft stretching for miles, all facing Calais. Each time German reconnaissance flew overhead, another patch was stitched into the great curtain of illusion. Coded transmissions bounced back and forth, weaving a tale just believable enough. The invasion, if it came, would strike at the shortest crossing. Once the enemy's finger was fixed on the map, the magician needed only to wait for the moment to whip away the cloth. The hardest part was not the steel, it was the time. Eisenhower studied moon charts and tide tables, the way a surgeon measures a heartbeat. He needed moonlight so paratroopers could see the ground, and half-tide at dawn so Rommel's obstacles stood exposed, yet the water was not too shallow to strand the landing craft. After weeks of calculation, only 3 windows emerged: June 5th, 6th, or 7th. He chose June 5th. The order went down like a knife cutting into wood. Then, on June 4th, the wind rose. The sea changed colour. A storm slammed in. Ships already underway were recalled, their horns moaning as they swung back, each one leaving a white wake like an eraser stroke across a freshly drawn page. That night, the forecast said the weather would hold foul for 2 weeks. A plan that needed moonlight and half-tide now teetered like a sandcastle before a wrong-timed wave. Inside the ship holds, shadows swayed with the current. Outside, the great curtain of deception still hung, its story half told. Everything stood still for a beat, just one beat, before the great gear would decide whether to turn again or stop for good. The storm that bent the bows of ships on June 4th had made the neat ink lines on the tide charts seem meaningless. The small conference room held its breath in silence. Then the forecast shifted. June 5th to 6th offered a weather window. Eisenhower looked up, meeting the faces around him, hollow from sleepless nights. Within 30 minutes, the decision dropped on the table like a block of lead. Launch on June 6th. One signal sent, and the entire machine roared back to life. But before that, on June 5th, the strike waves lifted off, sweeping across northern and western France to cut German reinforcements. Bridges, junctions, and rail yards went up in flames. In Normandy, 3 days of relentless bombardment tore apart the outskirts. Nearly 4,000 dead, both German soldiers and civilians. The telephone lines burned between London and Downing Street. Churchill worried about breaking French morale. Ike replied in a steady, deliberate voice, each word pressed down. If they didn't choke off Germany's rear now, tomorrow the beaches would become slaughterhouses for their own men. He didn't raise his tone, but everyone could hear the weight of the arithmetic, war's merciless equation that had to be solved. Night fell like a black curtain. Off Le Havre, small ships crept forward, belching smoke and steam, building a white wall over the waves. Far beyond, false smokestacks puffed steadily, sketching a phantom fleet to draw German eyes toward Calais. The cloth was spread, the illusion placed exactly where it needed to be. Meanwhile, deep inside training fields turned into launching grounds. Green lights gleamed on the fuselages of waiting C-47s. The 101st Airborne lined up, each man a black nail on a folded sheet of silk. Ike appeared without ceremony, no trumpets, no flashing cameras. He shook hands with small groups, heard their forced little jokes, and looked into faces painted dark against the moonlight. In one rare, quiet moment, he pulled out a slip of paper and wrote a short note. If the invasion failed, the fault was mine alone. The handwriting was calm, almost casual, as though signing for a delivery. But everyone knew he was signing for the weight of a steel tide about to break. Outside, the sky was dark as ink. On the Normandy coast, German sentries pulled collars high, eyes fixed on the horizon. They too heard the distant engines, and they too knew this day would come. They fought not for slogans, but for the lives of comrades in concrete bunkers, for the families asleep in towns behind them. Across the water, the Americans knew their firepower was greater. Their web of maintenance, supply lines, artificial harbours, flight paths, and antennae stronger than anything Germany could stitch together overnight. Yet between the two sides stretched a boundary thin as frost, a stray bullet, a late opening parachute, a boat shoved off course, and perfect charts would turn to wasted paper. A short whistle. The first paratrooper tilted his head back, swallowing hard. One hand gripped the parachute straps, the other checked the safety pin one last time. The tail door opened, the night wind slapped cold and wet. The first plane rolled forward, then the second, then the line stretched on. Outside, propeller shadows sliced the silver moonlight. On the ground, signal lamps flicked on and off in coded bursts, radios whispering clipped phrases like machine commands. At sea, the great convoys shifted course one last time southwest, hugging the plotted line. The deception smoke still drifted steadily, like a play pushing toward its climax. On shore, minefields and iron stakes stood silent. They knew nothing of strategy, only that they would explode when touched. Overhead, the sky thickened, dotted with faint lights moving quietly in formation. The countdown, 10, 9, 8. No grand artillery, no music swelling. Only the steady thrum of engines pressing into the heart of the night, letters folded in breast pockets, and millions of mechanical details meshing together in perfect rhythm for this one moment. Each C-47 swallowed by the clouds. On the water, a massive formation of 7,000 ships crept forward, covering a 45-mile front, nearly one vessel every 250 yards. Overhead, 11,000 aircraft wheeled, their wings painted with white stripes to prevent friendly fire, flying 10,000 sorties in a single day, their flight paths ripping the sky apart with a continuous roar. Fighters swept airfields clean, bombers sealed off railways, bridges and junctions. Deep inland, the French resistance tore up roads, cut telegraph lines, and blew a bridge that forced a German convoy to turn back. From sky to sea, from sea to shore, every beat linked into one pulse. The landing craft doors groaned, slowly grinding down, revealing faces blackened with oil and smoke. They stepped forward, breathing like the lungs of one great machine. Industrial superiority was not in slogans. It was in the sheer presence of countless machines at once, in the way everything meshed. Big ships carrying smaller ones, smaller ships unloading men, men instantly linked by radio to the skies above. But the other side of superiority was the price. Every time a ramp dropped, the line between life and death grew thinner. Sword was the first thrust into the grey wall. Smoke choked the chest, winds bent mortar fire. Sergeant O'Neill crouched low through the haze, a camera lens catching bodies rushing past, then shuddered violently. A black streak tore across the frame, the reel ended, leaving 600 casualties as numbers trapped between surf and stone. The beach was taken, but every yard of sand bore a name that would never answer back. At Juneau, rough seas wrecked the landing pattern. One craft veered wide, caught by the swell, and slammed off its safety corridor. Shouts drowned in the wind. The platoon leader glanced at his watch, tried counting heads, then stopped because the next wave was already coming in. 300 Canadian soldiers fell in that cold morning, but the gateway held, the spear point pushed toward Caen. Mud-streaked faces grinned crookedly. In moments like these, survival itself was a kind of skill. The signal from Utah came back to headquarters steady, like a long breath. Good news ran the wires. The beachhead held, the formations were advancing. In the dim room, officers looked at each other by the red glow of the radios, as though they'd stolen one rare pause. But that pause was only to brace for the deepest blow. Omaha. The scene turned steel grey. The pre-8-hour bombardment had missed its marks. The naval guns had not smashed enough of the defences. Landing craft, forced to release their troops far offshore to dodge fire, left men wading in deep water, heavy gear dragging them under. The tide rose faster than expected, colliding with Rommel's planted obstacles, shredding formations like torn cloth. German bullets skimmed the water's surface, a thin, cold sound, more merciless than any propaganda. Men fell with barely a cry, as if afraid to trouble comrades still clawing for the shore. For a moment, the much-vaunted edge of technology seemed to vanish in the storm of fire. The plans had not accounted for sea and wind conspiring together. But even in chaos, the system clawed to repair itself. Small groups self-formed, squads slipped through gaps narrow as knife cuts. One gunner spotted a crack in a bunker and called in adjusted naval fire by radio. A sergeant redirected an entire platoon with a single wave of his arm. The next man understood instantly. In one morning, the equation of machines and men was rewritten in blood. Many drowned before ever touching sand. Bodies lay face down, packs still strapped, laces tied tight, faces pressed into the salt water. Those who reached shore washed up onto a thin strip huddling under a web of fire. Every attempt to rise drew a storm that cut them down. Some 3,000 Americans remained on that beach, and the name Bloody Omaha was scratched in crude hands into the memory of the survivors. Across the line, Germans fought in the only way left, clinging to bunkers, manning guns, squeezing triggers until barrels burned because behind them lay their homeland, their families, just beyond a rail line already blown apart. Both sides knew retreat was no option, and death itself was often the only way to hold the line for the next wave to step forward. In headquarters, the risk of cancelling the invasion was spoken aloud. The words dropped into the air like a stone in a deep well. Cancellation meant abandoning those already clinging to the sand. It meant wiping away every other beachhead, just one. Between the calculus of reason and the pull of conscience, the choice was to stay. And as the sun dipped west, the news began to shift. Spearheads linked up inland. Trickles of supply began to flow. Omaha received reinforcements, and the silence on the radios turned into crisp, clipped commands. The bloodletting had not stopped, but the artery had found its line. By day's end, they dared to name it. The landings had succeeded. There was no cheering, only the scrape of a stretcher, the sound of water retreating, and the tread marks etched into wet sand. The tally was stark. 10,500 Allied casualties in a single day. The Germans suffered nearly the same. Numbers on both sides stood for faces erased from the frame. By the end of D-Day, the beaches settled into one brief breath. On the second day, the front roared again. Montgomery was present, cautious to the point that the Allied thrusts around Caen seemed compressed into a coiled spring. Ahead lay German strongpoints positioned on the city's edge, cleverly placed beyond the reach of saturation bombing. Planes came, bombs fell, dust rose like a sandstorm, then cleared, revealing gun emplacements and bunkers still bristling with fire. Columns of refugees dragged suitcases through shattered streets, their eyes avoiding the hollow doorways of empty homes. On June 7th to 9th, German counterattacks lashed out like blades, including the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Division. Tank treads crushed soft asphalt, the roar of engines mingling with loudspeakers blaring from the city, breaking any illusion of a quick strike to seize Caen. On the village outskirts, scattered Allied paratroopers who had landed off-target clustered into small pockets, short of ammunition, short of radios. They were captured in groups. On the maps, the red arrows of German advances slowly erased the scattered blue dots. Yet this accidental dispersal created its own illusion. From the sporadic firefights, the Germans believed airborne landings were far larger than they truly were. While Caen smouldered, Behind the beaches, the mulberries, the artificial harbours, reached full stride. Each day, 150 to 200 ships unloaded, some 7,000 vehicles rolled off steel bellies, and 15,000 tons of supplies poured onto the floating docks. Cranes turned slowly, cables screeched, treads clanked across pontoon bridges and surged inland. This was the true face of industrial superiority, turning a bare shoreline into a mobile rear base. Every soldier who stepped onto a gangway knew there was now an unbroken chain behind him. Fuel, ammunition, rations, bandages, spare radios. Hearing that, the Germans clamped the ring around Caen tighter. They too fought for survival. If those harbours breathed freely, the war would flow back toward them. Then nature struck back. A 40-year storm rolled in, twisting the sea, toppling phoenix caissons like scattered game pieces, shredding floating bridges into fragments, snapping pontoons from their chains. The wind howled, rain slashed sideways, the water heaved into walls, 4 days without pause. Captains turned to watch blocks of concrete, once thought eternal, drift heavy and broken. By dawn on June 23rd, skies cleared to reveal seas littered with wrecked ships and shattered timber. The American harbour was crippled. The timetable slipped 10 days. In command tents, pencils slashed maps, arrows bent away. Technology could raise harbours from the sea, but the sea still knew how to reclaim them. The storm had exposed the weakness of logistics. The Allies could not wait for Caen. The Americans swung the arrow toward Cherbourg, a true deep-water port, fixed at the peninsula's tip like an iron nail that had to be pulled. On the march, they passed villages wavering in smoke, bridges knocked down and patched with wooden beams, bomb craters still warm. By June 26th, American troops reached Cherbourg's outskirts. Gunfire rattled, then fell silent. General von Schlieben, the German commander, surrendered before the press. Photographs captured him wiping his shoes in front of the American general, a gesture of humiliation no one wished to prolong. 36,000 prisoners filed past, young and old faces mixed together, eyes cast downward to nowhere. Above them, a single white sail drifted across the sky, light as a period at the end of a sentence. A section of the Atlantic wall had collapsed, not with thunderous fire, but with the clink of iron locks and weary footsteps. The Germans still clung to every gun pit, every scrap of fortification, trading time for a threadbare hope. The maps opened again. From Cherbourg, the supply lines spread like arteries. Along the paper's edge, a thin line ran toward Paris. The smoke was still thick, but the door was ajar. "The spearhead now has a deep-water port," a staff officer murmured, as though reminding himself. "The rest will be the road through ashes." From Cherbourg, the arrow of logistics began to breathe steadily, but to the east, Caen still stuck like a bone lodged in the throat of the campaign. On D-Day, Montgomery had drawn a straight line through the city, the blue arrow thrust deep into its centre, neat as chalk across a sand table. In battle, that arrow was stopped cold by the Panzer SS on the open fields. From then on, every push by the British and Canadians around Caen felt like trying to shift a stone buried half its weight in mud. The city lay cradled among wheat fields and low rows of trees. The Germans did not hug the urban districts. They built their defensive ring on the outskirts, where artillery and strong points could strike at any column breaking free from the beaches. And so, when the bombing rained down on the inner city, the outer batteries still held their ground. For 2 days of close fighting, the skies over Caen darkened, then turned silver with dust. More than 2,500 tons of bombs fell, streets gouged into trenches, rooftops dropping like leaves, 3/4 of the city destroyed. Some neighbourhoods had nothing left but window frames, standing lopsided against the sky, like photographs waiting for a wall. Around 2,000 civilians died. The survivors clutched children as they crossed the rubble. one hand dragging a suitcase, the other holding a husband's hat just pulled from the dust. The British and Canadian infantry advanced the only way possible, yard by yard. Maps were folded small, compasses were useless in the maze of collapsed walls and smoking bricks. Distance shrank to a courtyard between charred walls, to an intersection where a second-story floor had fallen and sealed the street. Two soldiers squeezed through a hole, lit a flame to dry soaked field telephone wires, and spliced contact back to their platoon. Every sound might be a trap. The clink of dishes could be a machine gun being reset. A cat's cry could mask a scout team shifting position. Every choice was measured between a heartbeat and a chance to live. The Germans would not yield either. They clung to the outer ring with whatever remained. Bullets, barbed wire, machine gun nests hidden behind shattered walls, an armoured car crawling over rubble like a beetle on a slope. Many crews had no word that their homes inside the city were already reduced to rubble. They had no link but shouted orders carried on the wind. Yet they knew, if the outer belt collapsed, that blue arrow would slash through, and behind them lay a country breaking apart from the west to east. They stayed. Gun barrels burned hot and cooled between bursts, calloused hands forced to grip the metal like holding a living beast. Montgomery came to Caen after many weeks, his polished shoes unsullied by dust. He walked streets now stripped down to names, listening to clipped reports. British strength of 115,000 had pushed into the city's eastern side. The front was no longer a straight arrow like in early June, but bent and jagged, following surviving walls, freshly dug trenches, improvised guard posts. He closed his notebook. On the page, the military symbols drew tight together like an exhaled breath. At twilight, one last column of refugees crossed through, wrapped in coarse blankets, stepping over sidewalks that no longer existed. A mother bent to pick up a wet book, flipped through a few pages stuck together, then set it down again. Nearby, a field nurse washed her hands in the day's last clean water, drying them with a scrap of curtain. She stepped into the next room, where a Canadian soldier lay with eyes shut as if asleep, lips still moving with a half-finished sentence of French tangled with English. At last, someone whispered, "Caen is no longer the objective." Another asked, "Then what is it?" The reply fell like dust. "It's the cost." From that moment, Caen stood as a symbol, a city shattered in bomb smoke, where tactical arrows bent beneath the weight of the living, the dead, and the passing shadows of those who left only footprints in the dust. Maps would still be spread open, orders would still be given, but in each command there would linger a short silence for Caen, the silence of a heartbeat, where life and death met and parted, thin as the paper in a notebook stained with ash. From Caen, the smoke of bombing had barely lifted before the wind carried it southwest. There, the Americans entered a different world, the bocage, hedgerows of ancient trees grown tight together, roots sunk deep, earth piled high into ridges, tangled with vines. Every field was a sealed square, four sides enclosed by green walls thicker than concrete from the eye level of a soldier. The front collapsed into narrow gates. Tanks could not turn, infantry could not fan out, formations broke into scattered clusters, each group wandering into a different stretch of maze, unable to see or hear the others. A single German machine gun hidden behind a hedgerow could pin down an entire platoon. The earthen bank rose to chest height, roots jutting like spears, barring a clean jump across. Each hedge was a natural fortress, where the defender had only to wait. The attacker had to hug the ground, guessing at angles of fire. One American scout team crawled to the roots, slipped through a patch of sunken earth, searching for a slit to see through. They found only a piece of sky, no bigger than a hand, and no guarantee that grenades weren't already waiting on the far side. Trees swallowed the horizon. All signals, shouts, nudges, hand signs, blurred into confusion as leaf brushed leaf. American tanks tried to force openings. but the bocage turned them into caged beasts. On raised farm lanes, their underbellies were exposed when cresting ridges, the unarmoured steel laid bare before German anti-tank guns. In the green labyrinth, the tongues of fire from barrels were short and sharp, snapping back into the shooter's chest with clean reports. Whenever a tank tried to turn inside the narrow corridors, its treads slipped on damp soil, its frame tilted precariously, and every crewman knew that a single well-placed shot would end it. They held their breath, inching forward, sweat running down their collars in the acrid stench of engine oil. The battle became brute labour. Squad leaders dug with shovels, carving footholds into the banks. Engineers laid charges, burying them in tree roots, counting beats before the pull. Earth sprayed upward, branches fell like rain, yet still a hidden ridge waited for a stumbling foot. Another squad slid through a bomb crater, pressing themselves flat against roots to dodge fragments. Every yard forward was measured in time and heartbeats. The Germans knew their advantage. They wore the bocage like their own skin. When pressed, they slipped back through the next hedge, waiting at the bend with reloaded rifles. A light gun crew, hand-dragged through the trees, fired 3 rounds and vanished, leaving echoes that tricked Americans into searching the wrong direction. A sniper waited half a day for one target, the radio man, then melted away like a shadow. Ammunition was scarce, but terrain was abundant. Knowing where the slope dipped or the soil sank was enough to lead an enemy into one wrong step. In every square of field, America's industrial superiority shrank. There were no open plains to call in blanket bombing, no long runways for supply rhythms like on the beaches. Yet the system still found ways to slip through cracks. Light radio teams shortened messages to nothing but coordinates. Platoons set rendezvous points in fresh bomb craters. Field surgeons worked at the bank's edge, the shade of tree canopies as their roof. One lieutenant spread aerial reconnaissance photos across a jeep's hood, penciling the hedgerows as if they were city streets. He no longer drew arrows, but intersections, places where small groups might meet without shooting by mistake. Day by day, exhaustion seeped from skin into bone. Inside the green walls, sound became a traitor. Insect hum could swallow the click of a bolt, wind through leaves could mimic footsteps, the rumble of a friendly tank beyond one hedge sounded like the enemy's. Each soldier learned to breathe slow, just to hear better. And each time a grenade went off, they glanced at their own hands, an odd reflex, checking that their bodies were still whole. Some nights, flares lit the sky, trees casting jagged shadows across the ground, throwing back the light of a stage where life and death played wordless roles. Thousands of Americans fell in these bocage traps, square fields without names, where gravestones were wild grass and ancient roots. Each time a unit reported, "We've crossed one hedgerow," headquarters marked it with a tiny dot on the map, so small it barely covered the smudge of a thumb. And when that dot was erased, it vanished with a single stroke, never speaking the face that had just disappeared. On the map tables, the American advance barely inched. Dots crept step by step, stopped, fell back, then gained half a square. The whole campaign felt trapped inside a suffocating frame. The deadlock was not for lack of men, tanks, or shells. It was because the maze itself twisted every exit into another turn. Yet in that bleak deadlock there came a faint tapping, the pencil pressing a darker line, stitching intersections together on the map. Somewhere in the fields, a door was about to give. On the next page of a notebook, someone had just written one word, turning point. By late July, every channel of communication converged on a dirt strip between Saint-Lô and Perrier, the backbone of the German line at the western edge of the bocage. From first light, the sky carried a strange roar, not the scattered thrum of engines, but a wall of sound rolling in, thick as storm clouds. The bomb bays opened. Carpet bombing was not a single punch, but thousands of fingers striking the earth at once. Fields that only yesterday had been green mazes turned instantly into seas of fire. Earth shot up in pillars, trees tore from their roots like cork stoppers, black smoke twisted into waves higher than church steeples. Everything blurred behind a screen of dust, each blast piling on the next. At the edge of a field, an armoured car tried to pivot in retreat. The ground beneath it sank like foam, trapping its wheels in flame. A German panzer division, the name General Lehr smudged into memory, was erased at the very spot the Americans had circled weeks before. Overwhelming firepower never stood alone. It came to the right place at the right time. On the bocage's edge, American radio teams crouched behind earthen banks, headphones pressed tight, voices trimmed to bare minimum. Coordinates, codes, confirmation. There were no arrows of to and from anymore, only intersections lit by signals. As the waves of bombs lifted, engineer squads sprang forward, steel blades biting into ancient roots, blasting open narrow gates. The doorways left by the bombs widened with satchel charges, the ground still hot, the smell of gunpowder and sap mixing into a kind of new asphalt. Behind them, tanks and jeeps surged through, red dust streaking across windshields. Bradley had waited for this moment. He once described Operation Cobra as a breath, pulling back deep enough to draw air, then exhaling into the enemy's flank. When the doors opened, he hurled in flanking thrusts, pinning the Germans into corners with no way out. At headquarters, a pencil thickened the line across Coutances, Avranches and Granville, names strange as echoes from a dream, yet each a milestone in the escape from the bocage. Patton swept in like a dry wind. He wasted no words. He drove his columns as a man who preferred breaking trails. The more crowded the path, the more he split it. The tighter the choke, the more he forced it open. Country roads, once fit only for carts, roared with engines. Small bridges built for horses were braced in haste with beams, rope, and borrowed steel. At each crossroads, a sergeant chalked arrows on a wall. "Keep going, don't stop." Orders were boiled down so lean that life and death hung on a single stroke. The Germans did not vanish. They splintered. In the thinning smoke, hand-pulled light guns still swung their barrels, firing 3 shots before shifting, each burst like an exclamation mark. A company split in 2 between hedgerows. The forward half automatically turned back to cover the rear. And as they fell back, the supply lines from Brittany and the south of the Loire, cut since early June, stretched even thinner. The pressure of machinery became pressure of time, then the suffocating pressure of breath itself. Speed became its own weapon. American machines devoured roads like fire devours wind. Mobile repair teams shadowed the advance, patching treads, swapping spark plugs, adjusting carburetors in the very fields still warm from shell fire. Under the hood of a jeep, aerial photos spread out. Not grey blurs anymore, but a legible map. This patch of forest burned, meaning visibility was open here. That ditch collapsed, meaning tanks could cut across instead of detouring. Each technical decision saved minutes, and those minutes gathered into an afternoon, enough to tear through the thinnest point of the line. Then the words changed. Stalemate gave way to breakthrough. At headquarters, the map shifted so fast that fingers holding it down couldn't keep pace. Arrows spread toward Brittany and along the Loire. A tin-roofed shop in a nameless village suddenly had American trucks rolling by. A child, clutching a filthy cat, stared after them, unaware that a strategic blow had just crossed his doorstep. The farther they pushed beyond the bocage, the more the open fields gave back American strength. Radios called, planes answered, engineers pointed, tanks thundered through. The war, at last, was moving back onto its proper ground. By day's end, the sense of a giant breaking free of chains was so clear that no one needed to say it. Field depots opened along the roadside, cans of water passed hand to hand like parts on an assembly line. Soldiers, mingled with dust and smoke, looked up to see the sky widen again. not the shut lid of the bocage. Ahead lay a new emptiness, where spearheads might meet not by accident at a hedgerow, but by design in a circle closing on space too large for men to fill. On the map, a hollow formed between the arrows, a pocket opening toward Argentan and Falaise. From there, the hunt would begin. After the blow of Cobra, the ground beneath the German defenders was no longer firm. To seize back the initiative, Germany counter-attacked at Mortagne, a thrust straight into the American flank, hoping to halt the breakout and drive the enemy back to the beaches. In the foggy morning, tank and infantry columns surged forward, treads clawing at wet roads, artillery opening like a storm of hail. But the sky, once silent over the bocage, now struck back. Allied planes swooped low, rockets hissing across fields, short, sharp streaks of fire stabbing into the backs of columns rushing ahead. Every German gun crew that tried to plant a flag on a hill was hammered off it by blows from above. Mortagne stalled, then recoiled, leaving behind a charred trail and an army now trapped deep inside the jaws of a closing vice. Bradley had been waiting for that moment. He deliberately gave up a strip of flank to draw the enemy into the snare, like a hunter letting his prey step onto the steel of a trap. From the south, American armies curled around. From the north, the British and Canadians pressed down. Between them, the Poles held the high ground, the steel hinge of a door that swung shut. The map no longer showed arrows. It showed an arc thickening by the hour, each link a town, a crossroads, a dike. Ordinary names turned into the pressure points of a giant pursuit. The Germans did not wait silently for the hammer to fall. They sought every exit, village roads, slopes, forest edges, anything that hinted at a gap. Each convoy tried to hold its order in chaos. Each hand-pulled gun snapped up a firing angle to clear a strip for comrades to squeeze through. Small groups inside the tightening ring fought with the same ferocity as at the start. A platoon held a bell tower. A machine gun crew shifted positions 3 times to buy minutes. A driver whipped his horse to drag a field gun into softer earth. They fought not for slogans anymore, but for a few hundred yards of open road, for the chance that on the far side of a gap lay the way home. But the arc closed. The towns along the pocket's rim, those pins on the map, shook with the clash of guns and engines. On the heights, Polish soldiers braced against the wind, shoulders numb on their rifles, eyes fixed on the dirt road below, where enemy convoys rustled like ants scraped from their mound. To the west, British and Canadian infantry tightened their grip, each step one at a hedge, a ditch, a copse. To the south, fine dust clung to the hoods of American jeeps, radios crackling with clipped orders to change direction, as if scissors were cutting the last threads to sew the pocket shut. When the gate finally slammed, the disaster unfolded in full. The road out of Falaise became a torrent of chaos. Tanks, trucks, horse carts, infantry all tangled under barrages that fell like sleet. A half-track clawed at the slope of a wet field, its treads slipping, its hull tipping, cries choked off by an explosion nearby. Horses, crazed with fear, lashed at the air, then collapsed in their harnesses, eyes rolling white. Saplings splintered like wooden toys, road signs toppled, nails raining loose. At a bend, vehicles piled atop one another, steel jammed into steel like fish trapped in a net. Overhead, planes circled in silence, iron kites that from time to time dropped a streak of light before vanishing into the smoke. Inside that slaughterhouse, German groups clawed at the smoke for escape, trading men and guns for paths just wide enough for one vehicle. At some points, they broke across a trench of fire, only to be trapped by the next. At others, they shoved aside a wreck, only for shells from the far ridge to drive them headlong into ditches, arms over heads, waiting for the next strike. Both sides were exhausted, but the tug never ceased. Every yard gained was lost again. Every group that slipped through dragged another left behind. When the guns slackened, the picture froze into a horror of silence. Charred hulks, twisted wheels, tarps sagging like dried skin. Horses strewn along the road, hooves still clawing the soil. Soldiers slumped by vehicles, helmets rolling into puddles of oil. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Germans lay dead here. 30,000 to 40,000 were captured, numbers that could only be read by walking hundreds of steps down a road thick with the stench of smoke and burning flesh. Eisenhower would later call it the greatest killing ground any battlefield has ever known. And men understood, for there was no other word to hold the sensation of walking through bodies already beginning to rot. Only when checkpoints were set, prisoner lists compiled and clearing teams opened roads for supply convoys did commanders finally allow themselves to press their pens to the map. Normandy was gone from German hands, not because a door had closed, but because a wall had fallen. Falaise, in the memories of survivors, was not a place name. It was a smell that never washed away, a colour of smoke, a sound of breaking metal that would not end. Tomorrow, the map would run toward the Seine. But before moving on, everyone understood. That blank space on the paper had been bought by a black road paid for in bone and steel. After Falaise, the map shifted like floodwaters breaking loose. Black lines surged toward the Seine. Bridges blown apart were patched with steel beams and wooden planks. Supply convoys crawled forward behind long trails of dust. On August 19th, Paris flared with smoke. Inside the city, German checkpoints wavered amid sporadic gunfire and makeshift barricades. Overhead, the skies already belonged to the Allies. On the ground, intersections filled with the thunder of boots, shots, and alarm horns. German soldiers, after weeks of retreat through Normandy and the iron pocket of Falaise, began withdrawing east in endless convoys, a retreat both orderly and frantic, like ink dissolving into water. At the front, the Americans pressed faster. Jeeps flying neat flags raced through villages left silent by the campaign. Radios barked short, clipped orders. Engineers threw up field bridges across canals on the city's edge. Everything moved with a practiced rhythm. Mechanics, supply, communications, 3 wires twisted into one cord. This was when the American system showed its strength. The big gears no longer bogged down in the mud of the bocage, but spinning free along the highways that pointed toward the capital. At dawn, the first vehicles marked 2 EDB of Leclerc appeared on the city's edge. Tricolour flags flashed against the grey smoke. Earlier, de Gaulle had met Eisenhower, making the case plain. Paris was not just a coordinate, it was a symbol, and it had to be taken by French hands to restore national pride and prevent political fractures from breaking open at the very moment of victory. Ike listened in silence, then agreed. The choice carried military sense, avoiding a drawn-out street battle, and political weight. Paris would fall to a force bearing the face of France. From August 19th to 25th, the noose tightened. Resistance groups in the city rose from the shadows, coordinating to seize checkpoints, cut roads, hold bridges. Gunfire from windows mingled with cheers in the streets. Across the lines, the remaining German units fought to the last, not from faith in fading slogans, but from soldiers' instinct and sworn oaths. They turned grand buildings into redoubts, carved streets into killing grounds, fired, fell back, and fired again. Survival played out at each corner. The line between life and death was sometimes no more than a doorway just narrow enough to dodge a burst, a staircase collapsing a second late. Then the moment came. Paris was liberated. Leclerc's armoured columns rolled down boulevards still veiled with gun smoke, the clatter of tracks swallowed by the roar of people flooding out like a tide. Windows flew open, white tablecloths waved as flags, children ran alongside, grabbing jeep handles. Women threw their arms around the dusty shoulders of soldiers. Down the Champs-Élysées, de Gaulle strode in the centre, long-legged, back straight as a ruler, framed by a forest of flags and the cry, "Vive la France!" It was a parade, but also a proclamation. France, once crushed, stood upright before the world, and the Allies recognized it. America, though easing into the background of the political frame, stood firmly in the foreground of how modern war was fought, bringing an unprecedented fleet to the shore, building harbours where none existed, pushing supply lines through storms and broken terrain, turning industry into muscle that could move for months without pause. If Germany had relied on the craft of defence and sharp thrusts, America had crushed with scale, speed and the ability to absorb failure and make the system stronger the next time. Every slip on the sand, every hedge of the bocage, every storm that tore apart Mulberry, each was folded back into the machine as a lesson. And in that wide frame, another truth appeared. The very thing Goebbels mocked as a mongrel coalition had been the key to unlocking Paris. Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, black soldiers, Indian units, North Africans, all joined not as scattered fragments, but as a resilient structure that shared burdens and roles. If Hitler believed impurity bred only chaos, Normandy and Paris had proven the opposite. Diversity created adaptability, welding disparate pieces into a single driving force. For soldiers, such concepts weren't spoken. They were in the gas can delivered on time, the stretcher waiting in the right place, the field line still working after a barrage. They were in the nod of a Canadian sergeant to an American staff sergeant, in the handshake of a French resistance fighter with a black supply driver climbing down from his truck. Small acts of cohesion pulled an entire city back into daylight. As shadows stretched across the Place de la Concorde, Eisenhower and Bradley stood a half-step back, letting de Gaulle fill the frame, an act both courteous and wise. They knew that from the first week of June until now, the machine they had built had run on track, and they also knew that military victory would be hollow without its political counterpart. To the east, the war was not over. The road to Berlin was still long and cold. But that day, beneath flags and footsteps, an illusion was buried. The illusion that a pure race was unbeatable. Normandy had opened not only a path into Europe, it had opened a truth. Diversity was not weakness, it was the root of strength. From the scornful words blared from propaganda loudspeakers to the footsteps echoing on the boulevards of Paris, that distance had been bridged by blood, steel, and will. And, when the first lights flickered on along the avenues that night, it was clear. America and her allies had won not just with better weapons, but with a human technology machine that knew how to stand together, across the razor-thin line between life and death, to redraw the map of Europe.